What's up guys, Doomwake here. Welcome to another video here on the channel. As always, before we continue, you know what I'm going to say, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Please be sure to let me know in the comment section below what you thought of the video, because today's going to be a little bit different. We've been doing a lot of gameplay over the past, basically this channel is almost always gameplay, but I wanted to try something a little bit different. So please let me know, did you enjoy the video? And let me know what your thoughts are on it. So this is kind of going to be like a deep dive or a deck tech on what I perceive from my experience playing with and against this deck and playing other decks, what I believe to be currently, I believe this is the best deck in the format. I know that that's probably going to be a hot take, and I'm sure that a lot of other people have different opinions on that, but I just think that this deck kind of does it all, and that deck, as you can see in front of you, is Temur Crashcade, or Temur Footfalls, Temur Rhinos, whatever you want to call it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go over all of the cards individually, what they do in the deck, what makes the deck really good, and just kind of the general theory behind it. So at its core, we are a Cascade deck, as you can see. You know, Cascade decks of the past, Living End, and when people were cascading into Valky for however long that lasted, probably a little bit longer than it should have. But we are a Cascade deck, which means we are cascading into one spell and one spell only, and every other card in our deck has to have a three mana value or higher, which is, you know, but when I sort by converted mana cost, you can see that's how our curve looks. So that's kind of the general idea, is we're just always cascading into a Crashing Footfalls. Sounds pretty simple. Now, a lot of people associate the word Cascade with the archetype combo. Combo meaning, you know, you're trying to assemble A plus B, and you're trying to get your opponent dead on the spot. And while, yes, you know, there are going to be games where you just cast a Shardless Agent on turn 3 and you make 10 power, and then your opponent may or may not just be able to do anything about that. But this isn't really a combo deck in the true sense of the word, because if you look at, you know, what this deck's game plan is, you know, compared to other Cascade decks in the past, like Living End and that kind of stuff, when the Living End player casts a Cascade spell and cascades into Living End, the game usually ends on the spot. They're putting 20 power into play, sometimes on your opponent's end step, and then they're untapping and attacking you for 20. That means the game's over when they resolve their Cascade spell. That's not how this deck works. When you Cascade and you put 10 power into play, the game's not over on the spot. Your opponent can cast removal spells in your 4/4s. It's much easier to interact with, okay? So what we're doing is we're sacrificing the explosiveness of being able to kill your opponent on the spot with something like Living End. And we're trading that with more cards that are just good Magic cards. Like if you look at the Living End deck, it's playing Architects of Will and Curator of Mysteries and Strike Riverwinder and all these cycling cards that don't really have text outside of just discard, draw card, discard, draw card. And those decks in particular are much more susceptible to graveyard hate. Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, Grafdigger's, I guess not Grafdigger's Cage. Please don't Grafdigger's Cage against Living End. That doesn't work the way you want it to. Nihil Spellbomb out of the Urza Saga deck, stuff like that. And we're trading the card quality, because we don't have all of just a pile of cards that literally only just, you know, cycle draw card. And we're trading the ability to be good against graveyard hate for just cards that are just good, you know? Brazen Borrower, 2-mana interactive spell, bounces any permanent. Just, you know, you can think of this deck as like a tempo deck, right? It's trying to put some like 3 mana for 8 power, even if it's just with an outburst, is undercosted, right? If you're paying 3 mana for 2 4/4s, that's just an undercosted play. So it's utilizing the mana discount it gets on its threats and combining that with powerful tempo positive plays like Brazen Borrower, like Force of Negation, which is a free counter spell, Fury, which is a free removal spell, Fire Ice, which you can, you know, essentially there's common play patterns where you turn to ice your opponent on their upkeep, they don't get to play a spell, then you untap and you play your Shardless Agent, right? It's not a combo deck. It's just trying to tempo your opponent out, gain these, you know, potentially small tempo positive plays to sort of prevent your opponent from doing a thing just for one turn, and then using that one turn window to put a bunch of power into play, but not ending the game on the spot again. But the one card that that's been a new inclusion to this deck recently. I mean, we can go a little bit further back and we can talk about the inclusion of Fury, which I think started about a month and a half ago, if I remember correctly. There was a Mox event, and I was talking in my Facebook group with a bunch of people who were interested in playing this Rhinos deck, and I was looking at previous versions. And they all had like Jace the Mind Sculptor and Cryptic Command, and I was just like, well, what if we just played a more tempo positive card that also happened to be a free spell, because free spells are awesome when you're trying to tempo your opponent out, and that's kind of where the inclusion of Fury came in. And then from there, it became pretty standard to play Fury and Prismari Command, whereas before those were just more blue cards, Cryptic and Jace. Some lists have been playing Teferi Time Raveler in the past. But I think that the 4-color mana base is a little bit more rough, so that's kind of why we're sticking with just straight-up Temur here. But just, again, to kind of go over the cards one by one. So Crashing Footfalls, obviously you'd play 4 of this card. There are some, I think there are maybe some people who argue that playing 3 might be correct, but there's just a lot of games where you can go turn 1, suspend a Crashing Footfalls, and then interact with your opponent up the curve. You have removal spells like Prismari Command and Fire Ice, so you can just keep interacting with them up the curve up until the point where you're 4 turns later, you're now making 2 4/4s, and that's just fine because you can keep interacting with your opponent because that's how your deck is. Your deck is just all interactive spells. So that's why I think the full 4 copies is good. Also, the nature of Crashing Footfalls means it's more likely your opponent, again, can interact with you, and that there are a lot of games where you have to go through all 4 Footfalls to win. So that's why we're choosing to play 4 copies. Brazen Borrower, again, 2-mana interactive spell, bounces any permanent. Really, really good against Chalice of the Void and Void Mirror, cards that are typically good against Cascade, because you can set up a turn where you go end of turn, bounce their 1 piece of hate, untap, cast your Cascade spell, profit, go from there. So that's how we're playing the full 4 copies. It's too versatile to not play less than 4 copies, and especially in post-board games against the control decks, you want to play more of this kind of flash style game, and that's where Brazen Borrower is so good. Just being able to hold up mana. If your opponent doesn't interact, you just play a 3/1 flyer, untap, attack. Now you have a threat in play that they have to answer on their own main phase, which maybe they won't, or maybe they are not equipped to, or don't really want to, and that messes with their curve a little bit. So definitely an awesome card to play 4 of. Force of Negation, which I think is just pretty much a staple at this point. There are definitely going to be situations on turn 3 where you go Outburst on your opponent's turn, they have a counterspell, you force their counterspell, and now you've untapped with 8 power, and pretty trivial to just kind of close it out from there. So Force of Negation, very good in tandem with Violent Outburst. It's not quite as good with Shardless, because obviously you can't Shardless on your turn and then protect it with Force of Negation, but just a really good card. Also stops, it's good against some of the combo decks. Like, it is good in the Cascade Mirror, like good against Living End and things of that nature. So definitely a worthy inclusion as a 4 of. And then we get to a card that is a relatively new addition to this deck, and one that I haven't seen anybody playing prior to me adding it to this deck, and that's Seasoned Pyromancer. So previously, we had Bone Crusher Giant as another interactive spell. But if you take a look at the deck, we have Brazen Borrower, Fire Ice, Fury, Dead Gone, and Prismari Command as sort of other modes of interaction. And Bone Crusher Giant happened to be the worst one of those pieces of interaction. And with the amount of other interaction we have, I don't think you need to max out on that type of interaction. And Seasoned Pyromancer is especially awesome because it allows you to discard some of your more situational cards, like Force of Negation and Fury and Dead Gone. Those are cards that are good in some matchups, but there are going to be a lot of spots where your opponent doesn't present a target for it, or it's just not good in the matchup. And there, Seasoned Pyromancer allows you to turn those otherwise dead cards into actual pieces of cardboard. Presents 3 mana for 4 power, not the biggest threat in the world, but it does pressure your opponent into doing something. And also, if you play it empty-handed, it's just raw card advantage, which this deck was missing. It had in Brazen Borrower and Bone Crusher Giant are technically 2-for-1s, but specifically with Bone Crusher Giant, it's very slow and very clunky and mana intensive. And Seasoned Pyromancer is just a good clean, if you're empty-handed, 3 mana, bam, straight up 2-for-1. So, which is important in a lot of matchups that go a little bit longer, like Control. Sometimes they're mirror match, you end up trading a lot of resources, and Pyromancer putting you up 2 cards can be extremely important. So that's why I am a huge fan of Seasoned Pyromancer. I know that a lot of people are pro Bone Crusher Giant, but I would recommend sticking with Pyromancer if you're going to pick this deck up. Prismari Command, going down a little bit in stock for me personally, with the decrease in hammer time over the past couple of weeks. It's a card that we added to the deck because when we added Fury, we needed another blue, red, gold card because we have 4 Force of Negation, 4 Fury. So we want a card that can pitch to both of those in addition to Fire Ice. And it just so happened that Prismari Command was good at the time because hammer time was popular, and being able to shock one of their creatures and shatter a hammer, or something like that, you usually get a pretty clean 2-for-1 with Prismari Command against them. That being said, it might be time to look into additional potential other Izzet gold cards that you could fill into that spot. But Prismari Command does, similar to Seasoned Pyromancer, allow you to loot through cards that are potentially bad in some matchups, because again, you do have some situational cards. So it is there is definitely utility for it, and but yeah, that one is one I'm considering potentially looking into other options for. But for now, we'll stick with the command. There's still a bunch of chalices and void mirrors, and being able to shatter those is pretty good too. Obviously, Violent Upright, Shardless Agent, play 8 of those. I don't think I need to go into detail on that. Fire Ice. Here's another one that is quite. When you look at Fire Ice, it doesn't really appear to be as good as it is on first read. But remember, we are trying to tempo our opponent out. We're trying to make tempo positive plays. And when you're on the play and you play your second land and your opponent has 1 land in play and you ice their land and then they just go land go planning to play a 2-drop, that is Time Walk. Like, a lot of people don't realize how often turn 2 ice is just Time Walk. And Time Walk is a card that, if it was legal in Modern, it would be banned within seconds of its being legal, right? And I can't stress enough how good icing your opponent on turn 2 is, to the point where I would probably play 8 to 12 copies if I was allowed to, because it's just that good. Obviously there are going to be games where your opponent leads on, DRC into Ragavan, and you can fire 2 of them, and sometimes you get some good 2-for-1s that way. But I would probably say about 80% of the time I'm just casting ice. I'm just tapping their land. There's also some sick plays, if your opponent leaves up 2 mana later in the game, you can ice them end step and maybe find a window to resolve a Cascade spell. You can tap blockers down because your deck is not the best at dealing with creatures that have more than 4 toughness outside of Fury range. So you can tap some large constructs or some Tarmogoyfs. You can tap a creature with a hammer on it. It's so versatile in what it does. And, a huge addition from MH2 to this archetype. But just overall, just an amazing card. Would highly recommend playing 4 copies. 2 Dead Gone. So Dead Gone, for those of you who don't know, it's 1 red, deal 2 to a creature, or 2 and a red, bounce a creature you don't control. I used to only have 1 copy of Dead Gone, but ever since I've cut Bone Crusher from the deck in favor of Seasoned Pyromancer, I wanted to go up an additional cheaper removal spell. And the nice thing about Dead Gone is it is your only way, outside of Fury, which you don't really want to do, but it's your only way to interact with turn 1 Ragavan on the draw. So there are arguments to maybe playing a 3rd copy over the 1 Murktide region. I'm a big fan of the Murktide. We'll go into that in a second. But I think I like 2 copies, just, for more Ragavan insurance, and being able to bounce a creature is especially important against opposing Murktide regions because, once again, your deck doesn't have a ton of ways to interact with creatures outside of 4 toughness, so it is pretty important there. But a card that I don't mind having access to, I think 2 is probably about where I want to be moving forward. And then we go to 4 copies of Fury. Again, as we talked earlier, an addition that was, I think it was about a month and a half ago when we started putting Fury in our deck, and just ever since I've added Fury to this deck, I've never wanted to cut a copy. It's just, it can't be understated how backbreaking it is to being able to, even it's just a 2-for-2, right? Even if you kill 2 creatures and you pitch a card, it's an even trade. It's a 2-for-2. But again, just the tempo swings of being able to basically wrath their board and continue applying pressure because Fury is 0 mana. Imagine this scenario. Your opponent has 2 2/2s in play and it's turn 3, and you just go Fury, pitch a card, kill your board, play my land, put 10 power into play. You've decimated their entire board and put 10 power into play. There's no coming back from that, It's just, Fury is so unique in what it does. And just hard casting, 5 mana for a 3/3 that kills a creature. Also, you can kill planeswalkers, which is really important against the Fairy Time Raveler specifically. Just the card just does so much, and I can't imagine playing less than 4 copies. It's just so good. There's so many matchups where it's just such a huge swing. You know, being able to kill Thought-Knot Seers, and sometimes you can kill Tarmogoyfs with it, and Construct tokens, and then it being also good against control sometimes because you can kill planeswalkers, and then it's also good against, you know, the medium-sized creatures and the smaller creatures because you can kill multiple things. It just does too much to not play the full 4 copies. And then what I believe is probably the most controversial choice in the main deck, the 1 Murktide Regent. Very innocuous card. I know that, you know, obviously when you've seen Murktide Regent, you're probably thinking of it in the blue-red Murktide deck that has 4 copies of it, and we only have 1 copy. Now, if you look at our deck, our mana curve is not necessarily the friendliest towards Delve cards, right? We have a lot of 3 mana cards. However, Violent Outburst into Crashing Footfalls puts 2 spells in your graveyard. Fury, free spell. Force of Negation, free spell. Pyromancer and Prismari Command, discard 2 cards. You have 11 fetch lands. So for a deck that has a mana curve that looks like this, you have a surprising amount of ways to put cards into your graveyard. So in my opinion, I think the first copy of Murktide Regent is about as free as it gets. And when it's good, it's really good, because it means, you know, there are going to be games where your opponent plays a Chalice of the Void and you just kind of, you know, trade with them a little bit, and then you play a 7/7 and they have a Chalice in play and they did not necessarily prepare for that. So, because a lot of times your opponent's going to cut some of their spot removal, because spot removal is not good against 2/4/4s. You know, you're always down in that exchange. So if they cut their spot removal and you bring in you have the Murktide Regent just as a really, really cheap evasive threat. Also, being able to trade with opposing Murktide Regents sometimes is pretty important, because again, where our deck is a little bit light on interaction with, or being able to deal with creatures in play that have more than 4 toughness. You know, we have some bounce spells, but those are only temporary issues, or temporary answers, I should say. So I love the 1 Murktide Regent. I would never leave home without it. And then just going over the mana base, the only thing I will note about the mana base, 2 things specifically. 1, the Gemstone Caverns. I think 1 copy is perfect. I would never play more than 1 copy because drawing the second copy is really detrimental sometimes. But I think 1 copy is perfect. Don't be afraid to sideboard it out when you're on the play, because it doesn't really do anything when you're on the play. So in a faster matchup, maybe one where you're expecting to, you know, that the games that aren't going to go that long, don't be afraid to sideboard it out when you're on the play. Never board it out on the draw, but don't be afraid to board it out on the play. And then the Ketria Triome, which is a new addition that I'm starting to warm up to. I know that I've hated the tap land in the past because it's just so backbreaking when your third land comes into play tapped. If you just have 2 lands and you draw a Triome as your third land and can't cast a Cascade spell, that's the difference between winning and losing. Now, that being said, you don't have a ton of 1 mana plays. Obviously, your only turn 1 play is Crashing Footfalls. But so you can usually just fetch it as your first land. But there are going to be situations where you don't want to fetch it as your first land because you have Footfalls, and then you usually have a 2 mana spell to play on 2, and when you draw that Triome on 3, it's going to be pretty rough. So for now, I have it in the deck until I play a game where it's going to be my third land, and then I'll probably get it from the deck. But I don't mind it. I think that it's pretty close. You know, I usually am more risk adverse and don't play it, but we're playing it right now. There's not really a huge difference either way, I guess I should say. And then just lastly, just going over the sideboard here. Pretty straightforward sideboarding. 4 copies of Mystical Dispute, which is a card that you definitely want against the control decks. Just one of the, you know, when you are Cascade decks, remember, our mana value has to stay at 3 or above. Mystical Dispute is one of the only cards that is a 3 mana value card that you can play for 1 mana, you know? So you get into these spots a lot against control where you go Cascade spell, hold up Dispute, or, you know, just dispute their Teferi, dispute your Expressive Iteration. There's just so many cards that Dispute hits, and it's so important in those matchups that you basically have to play 4. You can't play less than 4 copies in the sideboard. I would consider playing more if I could, but, you know, maybe I wouldn't. But again, Dispute is just an awesome card in the Mirror Match, control decks, blue-red Murktide. Excuse me. So many matchups where it comes in, and it being a 1 mana counter spell is so huge. 3 copies of Blood Moon, which I know that I think it was Chris Giglio, and I know had been talking about playing Obsidian Charmaw over Blood Moon. Now, I don't hate that. I don't hate the idea of doing that, but I will warn you that there are a lot of matchups that Blood Moon comes in against where Charmaw is mostly a blank piece of cardboard, and specifically with the uptick in elementals recently. Obsidian Charmaw is a stone blank against elementals, and Blood Moon is a 10 out of 10 against them. So, and I believe that matchup is fairly close. I think, if one side is ahead, maybe I'd give a very, very slight edge to the elementals deck, but it's barely by 0.5%. It's really, really close. And Blood Moon moves the needle enough for me to where I really want to play it over something like Charmaw. Now, Charmaw is... The argument against Blood Moon is there are going to be games where you really just need to pressure your opponent. If you take a turn off of playing to play Blood Moon, and your opponent has an answer for it, you just basically time walked yourself, and your opponent is just going about their business. So it is going to be awkward sometimes, but I think the upside on Blood Moon is a lot higher. It's going to win you the game more often than Charmaw will. Just, Charmaw is... Think of Blood Moon as like the lights out punch, and Charmaw is just like the small uppercut. You know what I mean? It's not really the one that ends the fight. So that's kind of why I think I like Blood Moon a little bit better. But, I have been considering experimenting with Charmaw recently, so that might be something we might look into at some point. For Force of Vigor, Hammer Time is, I did talk about Hammer Time earlier not being as popular. However, there are other cards you want Force of Vigor against. There are some Chalice decks you want it, just any Urza Saga deck, and just random decks, Enchantress, and there's just so many situations where Force of Vigor is lights out. It's good against Amulet if people start bringing that back. But mostly here for Hammer Time and any of the other various Urza Saga decks that you would want that style of effect in. Where, and I think it is very important because Urza Saga can make creatures that are larger than 4/4. And as you can imagine, if one of your primary game plan is to put 4/4s into play and your opponent has 2 5/5s, it's probably not great for you. So you need to be able to answer Urza Saga early and often. So that's why I think Force of Vigor is very important. Endurance is a card that I didn't have initially. When I did my first sideboard guide for this deck, I didn't have Endurance. What did I have instead of Endurance? I think I had Fire Spout. And I was pretty, I wasn't in love with Fire Spout. It was okay. But with the uptick in Living End recently and, Innistrad Midnight Hunt coming into the fray, which is increasing the popularity of Reanimator and Phoenix. Endurance is really good right now, and I'm actually considering the 4th copy of Endurance over the 1 Clothis, specifically to deal with Phoenix and Reanimator and all these kind of graveyard strategies that are popping up, so that could be a consideration as well. But Endurance also really good against Mill if people are bringing that to the table. Just a very good card, very unique in what it does, and also the really nice thing about Endurance, it actually comes in against control decks, because as you can imagine, your opponent's control deck that has a bunch of Prismatic Endings and Supreme Verdicts as their removal spell of choice, a 3/4 flash, really good against that setup. Because if it resolves, right, they can't kill it with Fire Ice because they can't shock it. It has 4 toughness. They have to spend at least 3 mana on their own turn to be able to answer it. And once you've gotten them into that spot where they're tapping 3 mana on their own turn, you can then usually snowball that into more advantage for you, because that means they're probably committing enough mana to where you can go Shardless plus counter backup, or maybe they don't even have counter backup. They just have to tap out to kill the Endurance. So you kind of get some initiative there. Even though the control decks usually don't use their graveyard, Endurance still really good against them. And then last but not least, the 1 Clothis. Usually it's been here for the Lurrus decks because most of like the Jund Saga decks don't really have a way to get Clothis off the battlefield. But given the decrease in those decks, I am considering cutting the Clothis for the 4th Endurance. So that would be something to consider moving forward. So what are we? We're about 24 minutes in. I think I've mostly talked about everything that I wanted to. Again, this is a little bit different than our usual video. I'll probably cut it there. But If you made it all the way to the end, please let me know in the comment section below what you thought. Did you enjoy this kind of little deck deep dive? I'm not exactly sure what we want to call it. Maybe I'll figure something out for the title, some fancy clickbaity title. But let me know in the comments. Did you like this? Would you like to see this on more decks that I play? A little bit different than the usual gameplay stuff. So with all of that, I thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next one.